Welcome to the conference of the Global Apparel Sourcing Expo, the largest digital sourcing fair for the apparel industry in 2020. My name is Matthijs Grité. I'm the Secretary General of the International Apparel Federation, the global body for the apparel industry, with its core members, industry associations from all across the world, from all continents, uniting the apparel industry, actually the entire apparel ecosystem, with our mission to help build stronger, smarter, and more sustainable supply chains. The conference that you're now watching is part of the Global Apparel Sourcing Expo, and we're lucky to be able to address a number of important topics in this industry: sustainability, digitization, sourcing trends. And we're even more lucky to have some great speakers. And I'm now very proud to be able to announce Avedis Seferian, President and CEO of RAP, or the Worldwide Responsible Accredited Production. RAP is the apparel industry's largest dedicated social compliance organization. It's also an IF member, and we often work hand in hand improving our industry and the systems in our industry to the benefit of manufacturers and brands alike. So without further ado, I would like to give the word to Avedis.
Thank you, Matthijs. It's a real pleasure to be with you here, and wonderful to see the IAF making sure that even the pandemic does not get in the way of sharing useful and important information with the membership and with the supply chain at large. And in fact, a lot of the presentation I'm about to give you is in reaction to the pandemic, in a sense, and in trying to come up with a better world to move into once we are past this. I'm going to be introducing a new word, Symfonization, which is our term for a new paradigm for social compliance in the post-pandemic world. What I intend to cover is to begin with a very, very brief overview of RAP for those viewers and listeners who may not be familiar with my organization. Very soon after that, going into this idea that we want to talk about, introducing Symfonization to the world, and really just go through how did we get here, where are we going, and how will we get there pattern to the presentation before we conclude and hopefully save some time for question and answers and exchange between the two of us. So let's get right into it. An overview of RAP. RAP is Worldwide Responsible Accredited Production. As you said, Matthijs, we are the largest independent factory-based certification program that is dedicated to the sewn products industry, apparel, footwear, sewn products writ large. Even though our scope with regards to the kind of factories we certify is industry specific, our geographic scope is unlimited. We inspect and certify factories all over the world. The way we describe ourselves at RAP is we are an objective nonprofit team of global social compliance experts. That's who we are. What we do is we promote safe, lawful, humane, and ethical manufacturing around the world. That's our mission. That's what we do. And how we do it is through certification. That's our primary service. We, as I said, inspect and certify factories all over the world to make sure they're meeting the 12 principles of RAP that form that core assessment component for ensuring socially responsible manufacturing practices. And also, we consider education to be a part of our mission. So we're happy always to take part in events like this and other similar platforms where we're able to inform the world about some of these issues and provide best practices and solutions. Over the years, we have become the program of choice for industry associations. We're proud to be members of the IAF and many other such associations because we strongly believe that the way forward, the way to a sustainable supply chain, the way to a responsible sourcing program is in alignment with, in working with, together with the manufacturers and the buyers that essentially form the backbone of the supply chain. There are many organizations out there that are sort of the activist NGOs and other civil society organizations that play an important role. I certainly appreciate the attention they bring to these issues. But we have found that if you want to solve those issues, you really have to engage with the ones that are dealing with them, that are part of the challenges, because they're the ones equipped to actually deal with them and solve them. So we are philosophically of the position that if you want to see change happen in this industry, you have to work with the industry, not against it. So let me introduce to you this concept of symphonization. It's a made-up word, and we came up with it for a particular reason that I will get to. But the overview here, the overarching theme is that we believe that this pandemic that we are all suffering through right now does have a silver lining to it, and that is that it presents us an opportunity to reset, rethink the supply chain social compliance management paradigm. And that's going to involve a fundamental shift, moving away from the old way of doing things, which was this duplicative proprietary program where each brand and retailer had its own set of rules and its own audits that they had to be conducted, and factories, which, as you know, typically have multiple of these brands and retailers end up needing dozens of audits each year just to be able to continue to do business. Moving away from that duplicated proprietary program system to an approach involving a handful of specialized, professional, independent organizations like RAP that provide a menu of options for the supply chain to use as a whole instead of needing those proprietary duplicative programs. That's the overall theme here, and we'll get into now sort of an overview of how we arrive at that conclusion. And it begins with a slight foray into history, right? Understanding the old way of doing things, the pre-pandemic world. When social compliance as a concept first emerged in the mid to late 1990s, it got off on the wrong foot, unfortunately. And it basically began in an adversarial context. Buyers and manufacturers often saw each other through that lens as adversaries, as opposites. And the sort of way of thinking about it was that responsible sourcing was essentially a top-down sort of a thing. The buyers set the rules, and those rules focused on activities that the manufacturers conducted, and therefore they were the ones that were being, I don't want to say the word targeted, but they were the ones that it was flowing down that way. And as a matter of history, though, in the mid to late 1990s, even though some initial attempts had been put into motion so that there'd be only one set of rules, it didn't work out that way. All the buyers and retailers ended up promulgating their own codes, creating all this sort of cornucopia of standards out there, and developing internal programs to assess and audit against those codes. And so the proprietary social compliance programs and the plethora of them became the norm. And the result, as we both know, and as this industry has long suffered from, is this notion of audit fatigue, where, as I said, a given factory ends up needing multiple social compliance audits each year, most of them asking much the same thing. Over the last decade and a half, the reality of audit fatigue did set in, and folks did make attempts to harmonize the standards and try to alleviate audit fatigue. But again, as we both know, all those attempts have failed, and I have long maintained that they're all doomed to failure for the very simple reason that a let's just all do it one way approach simply does not work in this world. This is an industry that does not lend itself at all to one way. It's the fashion industry. There's all kinds of different fashions, all kinds of different sizes, all kinds of different brands and organizations and sizes and areas of interest. You cannot simply force them all to do things just one way. So all these attempts at harmonization all failed. And as I said, they were all doomed to fail because they all insisted on a one-size-fits-all solution, which is not practical. So what is the new way of doing things? How can we overcome that challenge? And how can we now get to a place where we are able to get to the end result we want, right? That harmony in that supply chain without the burden of failed harmonization attempts that actually have given that word harmonization a negative connotation for our industry. It's a loaded term with a lot of baggage. So how do we get there? Well, we start by addressing that initial false footing that we began this endeavor on, which is recognizing that it's not an adversarial setting. Responsible sourcing is a supply chain as a whole issue, not simply one end pitted against the other. All parties have responsibility to follow the rules. It's not, I mean, you want rules. You want the supply chain to be a safe, lawful, humane, ethical one. But those rules have to apply across that supply chain. And this pandemic has brought to fore a lot of questions in this regard with respect to things like purchasing practices and the challenges that has highlighted. And so those rules, supply chain, responsible sourcing, this is a supply chain as a whole challenge, not simply one end versus the other. And if you acknowledge that, then you also automatically come to the conclusion that because the old adage says that no chain is stronger than its weakest link, that you have to then have the whole chain collaborate. And to do that, you have to be as transparent as you can be, because, again, you are viewing this holistically as a supply chain problem, not one end pitted against the other. To get to that conclusion, which I think is sort of the logical place for us to get to, you look around and you see that the solution to audit fatigue is to replace those proprietary programs out there, as I said in that initial theme slide, with a menu of options approach. There are already a handful of professional organizations out there that do this work. That's what RAP does. That's what some of our peers do. You don't need the proprietary programs to get to the end that you're trying to achieve, and you don't need to impose additional audits to do that. Use these menu of program approaches and eliminate the duplicative audits. Because harmonization as a term is so loaded, and because we want to get to that end goal without imposing that one-size-fits-all approach that characterized harmonization attempts in the past, we wanted to come up with a new term for this approach. And the visual in our minds of this menu of options approach was of a symphony, an orchestra. Different instruments, each one played differently, making a different sound, but when played in symphony, in harmony, making beautiful music together. That visual gave us this term, symfonization, and that is the new paradigm for the post-pandemic world. Now, how did we get here? Right, I've told you sort of the history part of it, and as I mentioned, when you look at sort of the evolution of sourcing and you understand the move from owned and operated to outsourcing models and the result of decreased visibility that led to, it was the exposés of the mid-1990s of horrible working conditions in certain supply chains that resulted from that decreased visibility that led to the explosion of standards, which I talked about, the proliferation of corporate codes of conduct and social audits. The harmonization attempts that resulted a little bit later, about a decade and a half ago. For those folks interested in sort of a better understanding of those attempts, there really were two phases to the harmonization sort of adventures that we went through. Initially, the idea was, can we all create a single code? Everyone's got their own codes. They're all mostly similar. Can we come up with a single universal code? And that failed, again, because you might see that most of these codes are similar. But what distinguishes one from the other tends to be that area of focus for that brand or retailer, that thing that speaks to their own values. And while you might be able to agree on common technicalities, you're never going to come to a universal agreement on values, right? And so those attempts early on were recognized as being doomed to fail, which led to that second phase, the second flavor, which was, all right, we might not be able to agree on a single code, but can we at least agree on a single process? You know, everyone's got their own set of values and own ways of judging whether a factory is good or bad, but can we create some kind of equivalency, some kind of benchmarking process where the information is gathered in a way that is consistent, and then you can layer on your value judgments to that. And even those efforts, which are more sensible in their underpinning, failed because, once again, the problem is you're trying to force everyone to do things one single way. And a single solution is simply not how the world works. It's not a a viable approach, because folks have differing needs, have differing places that they're in with regards to their approach to these situations. And as the adage goes, there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? Or if you want to stick to the apparel space, there's more than one way to knit a sweater, right? You cannot impose a one-size-fits-all on this industry. It's simply not practical. So where are we going then, right? If we've understood this challenge, the answer as we propose it is symphonization, that idea of a menu of options approach replacing the proprietary programs as I have described it. This will have the very important result of reducing audit fatigue, something that has been a scourge for our industry, and really not at all a positive. In fact, it's a wasteful challenge, which this pandemic really brings to the fore as well, right? The importance of efficient ways of doing things. The secret sauce here is the recognition that you're no longer going to insist on a let's just all do this one way approach. All those attempts have failed. As I said, I've always maintained they're all doomed to fail for that very reason. And that's the beauty of symphonization. One size does not fit all. Symphonization allows you to create a menu of options, and this allows different organizations to move at their own pace, to understand that if they are, relatively speaking, early to the supply chain social compliance management practice, and their focus right now is still the first tier, then they can do that. They've got a menu of options that kind of speaks to just that space. If there are more advanced programs out there, brands and retailers, and there are players that we both know have been doing a great job for a while, they're looking to go beyond tier one. They're looking to focus on other issues more heavily, environment or other specific topics. They can have a more expansive menu of options. This is the beauty of an approach that understands that there are professional players out there. You can leverage them, and that you're doing so in a way that is much more efficient and therefore much more likely to be credible, because these programs are independent and they are not in the supply chain like you, Mr. Brand or Mr. Retailer, are. They don't have any vested interest in these factories. They are simply doing the fact checking that you as a brand and retailer have to do as part of your due diligence program. One other piece of this puzzle, so to speak, that we're putting together, symphonization, is that there's an invitation to the supply chain at large, to brands to drop their proprietary programs, and to manufacturers to say to brands that insist on them, here, we have this independent certificate, here's a RAP certificate, here's a RAP report, use this instead. It's also an invitation to our peer space, so that we, as programs that are independent and are doing good work in this area, collaborate further amongst ourselves to ensure full coverage of scopes and geographies, and not be repetitive or inefficient in our dealings as well. So altogether, it's about efficiency. It's about making this whole process that much more productive, more efficient, and that becomes even more important as social compliance now starts to penetrate deeper into it. So how will we get there? Well, that, as I said, is where the silver lining of the pandemic comes in. Take advantage of this crisis. This reality has already forced buyers, brands and retailers who had their own proprietary programs, to be more flexible. They couldn't execute against their own programs because they couldn't get their auditors into factories that were in lockdown. And so they, of necessity, ended up having to look around and see if there are options. Oh, here's a factory with a RAP certificate and a RAP report. Let's use that. And they have discovered that it works. It is something that is able to achieve the ends that they had, the due diligence requirements that they had to do. And so the key themes that I think emerged from that experience, which brands and retailers should really take to heart, is understanding that this is a supply chain issue, as I said, right? Not just a problem at one end of it, right? But something that refers to the whole chain, and therefore the need to make sure that every link is strong. And you do that, as I already mentioned, with greater transparency and collaboration. Ultimately, what this pandemic has shown us is you need supply chains to be more robust. You need them to be more flexible because you need them to be more resilient, right? The ones that have been able to come through this or are doing a better job getting through it are the ones that have that resilience, have that flexibility, and therefore are more robust. And that ultimately boils down to the sustainability of supply chains. That's what we're talking about here. You want this industry to be able to continue, you need the supply chains to be sustainable. You need them to be resilient. So to wrap it up, no pun intended, this pandemic has shown us, if nothing else, that the use of proprietary social audit programs, the old way of doing things, is a luxury that we can no longer afford, right? Supply chain social compliance management has to be lean and efficient and resilient, and simply having duplicative programs is a luxury that maybe in the old days was affordable, but now we know it cannot be justified anymore. So, and this conclusion, this knowledge came to us because we were forced to look at other options as buyers and retailers, and that necessity resulted in the conclusion that this is a viable approach. These are all pre-competitive things that we have to do as part of due diligence, and there are more efficient ways of doing it. We've seen that, and so my sort of invitation to this industry out there is, it is now time to make that temporary solution that you had sort of forced yourself to accept now a permanent one, because it works and it leads to much more efficient, much more resilient, much more sustainable supply chains. I will end here. For those listeners who might be interested in looking at the entire paper we published on this, there is a link here to the complete paper, and we'd be happy to answer any additional questions you might have after you've reviewed it. But for now, thank you for doing this, Matthias, and I am happy to spend some time chatting with you.
Well, thank you so much, Avedis. Thanks a lot, and I would like to congratulate the listeners for having chosen this this webinar, this presentation, because it's really interesting. It's an interesting approach on a very important topic. It's clear that during this pandemic, we are able to sort of kickstart some changes that have been overdue, and it's always good to have a strong vision. I like Symfonization because it just keeps giving you an endless sort of inspiration for thinking of, okay, so what else can happen to the orchestra, right? So where's the conductor? Do we need a conductor? Maybe we need some music critics on the side. I mean, it just keeps on. And I'm sure we'll have those conversations with the symphony in mind. Where we certainly find each other is in your main conclusion that this is all for the sustainability of the supply chain. That is the aim that we share.
Indeed.
So having established this is really important. Now back to the nitty-gritty of the supply chain. What are some of the challenges, Avedis, that you see when it comes to the adoption of Symfonization?
Yes, that's a great question, Matthias. And the challenge with Symfonization is the challenge that we had with the old approach as well, the harmonization attempts, right? The reality is that I understand the attraction of a proprietary program. I understand why a brand or retailer might think it's a good thing, because it gives them control, right? And that's something we all like. And as a person, as sort of from a psychology point of view, I understand the attraction. Overcoming that is the challenge, and I would submit that the sort of giving up those proprietary programs should not be seen by these brands and retailers as a lessening of control. Rather, it should be seen as a way for them to transfer resources that they've locked up in what is a pre-competitive function to then be able to use in the consumer-facing sort of competitive side of the business by focusing on brand mission-specific social compliance activities, which ultimately will be to their own benefit. Right? It makes them more competitive, makes them stand out more in the eyes of the consumer. This is a due diligence function, social compliance, that all of them are required to do. Right? In some cases, almost by legislation. When you talk about the requirements, or whether it's the OECD guidelines or other such things, or the UN guiding principles, these are pre-competitive things that they are required to do, and they should do those things as efficiently as possible. Do them right, do them with professional services, and then focus on the competitive stuff, the resources that they should allocate to making sure they compete better. That's the challenge, and that's, I think, the way to think about it for them to be able to succeed more on their side, and overcome any internal reluctance to go down this path. And this pandemic has been very helpful in that regard, right?
Yeah.
Really hammering home the importance of efficiency and understanding why you want to be there. And one final point to sort of overcome any reluctance is credibility, right? That's the other thing that the proprietary programs suffer from. Yes, you have control, but because of that control, you're subject to the question of, are you the fox guarding the henhouse? Right? You're the ones checking your factories. You have a vested interest in using these factories. So how independent is your assessment of these factories? So control is good, I understand that, but it is not favorable for independence. And really, you're not losing control. You are simply shifting that control to an area where you're going to be better able to differentiate yourself in the market with. So I think that these are surmountable challenges, and that's the silver lining of the pandemic that really brings home that point. And we hope that Symfonization will indeed be well received and executed by the buyers and the brands and retailers in the industry.
Great, thank you. Well, I hope everybody's listening, because these are really compelling arguments that you put forward there. So how can we help? And with we, I mean IF, but also organizations like ours, or some of our members, manufacturers associations. How can we move this forward?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. And the reality is, as I said, we are pitching this not simply as a change in the mentality of the buyers, the brands and the retailers, but of a change in the mentality of the supply chain as a whole, really seeing it as a holistic thing. And that really is where organizations like the IAF, manufacturers organizations, other associations come in with a very important role to play, right? You introduced the IAF and its mission, and in doing so, I love the way you said it. You see your role as to unify the industry. And that's one of the things that we are essentially pitching with Symfonization, right? There's no one size fits all. That's the whole essence here. But the unified approach is essentially that there is no one size fits all. Here's a menu of options. And if industry associations throw their weight behind that and make that something that they promote, that they sort of acknowledge as the right way, as the most efficient way, educate their members, it'll be very, very important. Manufacturers also, one of the challenges with why proprietary programs have been allowed to continue to exist is that manufacturers simply say, well, if you have to audit me, you have to audit me, right? But now we're saying to that space, guys, you've got a RAP certificate. You've got this RAP report, other independent program. I used RAP as an example, obviously, but the menu of options isn't limited. Use that. Push back to the buyer and say, you don't need to do this. Here's everything you need already. Use this. And if manufacturers associations sort of coalesce around that and advise their members to do that, and sort of are themselves pushing back to the buyer space, this is how organization can get the traction it needs and become the norm, the new paradigm for the post-pandemic world. All
right. No, I think that's something I can work with.
There you go.
Thank you very much for that. Last question, Avedis. A group in our supply chain, way at the beginning or the end, whatever way you look at it, we haven't touched upon the consumers. How do you see their role, especially in this past pandemic situation?
Yes, indeed. That's another great question, Matthias. The consumer's role has always been tricky, right? I think the challenge that this space has had is that consumers as a collective, first of all, they're not monolithic, right? There's no single sort of consumer sentiment out there. And they've tended in the past to be better. Consumers have been better at punishing bad guys than they have been at rewarding good guys. Right? If you do something bad, if there's a bad story in the supply chain about your factories, then consumers will boycott you, right? But those that don't consistently get rewarded, right? So I think it's been a fact that information, which is what the consumer is acting on, hasn't been perfect, has been limited. You only hear about the bad things and not so much necessarily about the good things. So one thing that was already happening in the pre-pandemic world was this increased transparency in the supply chain. As manufacturers were being more able to share with buyers what they're doing, and those brands and retailers were better able to share that practices with their consumers at the point of purchase. That trend will continue, will only get more pronounced. And I do believe that as consumers start to get better and better educated about what the practices are, then they will start making their decisions more carefully on a more informed basis. And that will form the ability for them to reward good behavior as well, and not just simply punish bad behavior. So I do think that when consumers are better educated through more transparent supply chains, they will have a more proactive role to play, because brands and retailers will recognize the importance of making sure that the good practices are known to them, and then that consumer-facing activities that I mentioned earlier, that they'll be able to pivot to, because they're not locking up resources in the pre-competitive stuff, will become much more important, and we will have a more harmonious, more resilient, more sustainable industry, and a more symphonized industry, if I say so myself.
Very good. Well, on that note, I think we should end. Thank you very much, Avedis, for an extremely interesting presentation. We all have some work to do, not just us, but the entire supply chain. But it's all for a good cause, and we have a feeling we're going in the right direction. So thank you very much, and good luck.
Indeed. Thank you, Matthias. It was a pleasure. Take care and stay safe.